Welcome to Spring Point Archives. 1853 trek to Dismal Creek, incredible journey. From the Effingham, Illinois Daily News, August 16, 1981, by Frank Parks. In the early 1850s, William Wilson, a third-generation stonecutter in Hull, England, was recruited for work in the quarries at Middletown, Connecticut. Wilson worked at the quarries in spite of the friction between the Irishman who had come earlier and the Englishman. When word reached Middletown that stonemasons were needed in central Illinois for railroad building, Wilson must have reacted immediately. The following are edited excerpts from Wilson's published journal. I left the work December 26, 1852, after 2 summers and 1 winter. I landed in Chicago December 30th, came all the way from New York by rail. Chicago in that day was nothing but near shanties. I left Chicago the next morning for LaSalle by way of the Rock Island Railroad, just open for travel to Morris, Grundy County. I got to Morris, where I found a man with a pair of bobsleds and a covered rig going to LaSalle. He told me I could ride with him, but he said he couldn't drive through that evening. He drove as far as Ottawa on the Illinois River. There we put up for the night and started for LaSalle the next morning. January 1st, 1853. There was a heap of stone masonry going on there at LaSalle, and that was my trade. I found 3 men that I was acquainted with in the old country, and they gave me the address of William Vipond, who had charge of all the masonry work, and that made me very anxious to get where he was. I spent a few days in LaSalle and headed for Dismal Creek, Clay County, Illinois, on foot, as there wasn't a railroad at that time. The first day's travel brought me about where Minooka now stands. I was making my way where the Illinois Central Main Track Survey was made, with nothing but the pegs to go by. I traveled all that day till night overtook me, not being aware the settlers were spread so thin at the time. I had lost sight of a house I saw when the sun was still about an hour high. I thought it was too soon to stop at that time. There I was on a blackened prairie just burned over, with not a star or a light, and it was very dark. When I could see nothing to go by, I stopped and thought. The wind was blowing on my right when I stopped, so I turned myself square around and took my back tracks. I walked till I saw a light and made straight for it. I came to a slough where the grass was standing up above the ice and water, so into it I went. Some places the ice would bear 1 foot up, and the other would go in above my knees. I traveled this way for about a quarter of a mile till I came to the other side. I came to the house after another half-mile and knocked on the door. It was some young folks, and when I asked if I could stay all night, they invited me in. People were not so scary of strangers in those days. They had me change my clothes. I was prepared for that. I had a dry suit in my grip. I had supper with them, and at bedtime they fired up the stove to dry my clothes. I had a pair of long stockings hanging on the oven door. The girl got up the next morning and fired up the stove without noticing my stockings, so the feet was burnt off. I took it in good part, said misfortune will happen, had my breakfast, and after thanking them, started on my next day's travel. All went well till I had traveled about 15 miles and came to a small creek. It had been frozen over a few days before. Then came a rain and made it raise. This broke the ice into flakes which drifted. I got on a flake to cross, and in I go up to the gable end of my breeches. I was well pleased it didn't go higher. Since it was getting towards evening, I stopped at the first house I saw, where I was able to dry out and spend the night. In the morning when I started out, I was 15 miles from Bloomington. I traveled about 4 miles when I came to a stream called Mackinaw. The stream was running bank full. I asked some men running a sawmill if there was a way to cross. They told me of a bridge 9 miles downstream. I left the railroad survey line and made for the bridge along an almost blind trail. When I came to the bridge, there was a well-traveled road to Bloomington. I stayed on the road 5 or 6 miles till I came to a small tavern and stayed all night there. I was still 15 miles from Bloomington. The next day I got the information I had better keep on the mail route between the county seats, working my way south. I passed through Bloomington a little after noon. It wasn't much of a place then, and came to a house at nightfall. For the first time I met with a cool reception. An old gentleman met me at the door. He told me he didn't take in tramps. He pointed to a light in the direction I wanted to go and said I could stay there. They would take anything. I walked a mile to the house and knocked on the door. As usual, I asked to stay all night. I looked inside, and when they opened the door, I counted 9 children, 3 men and 3 women, all in this 12 by 15 log cabin. They invited me in. The men had just been hunting and had about a barrel full of prairie chickens. I stayed all night and had a good night's rest. In the morning we had prairie chicken for breakfast. I tell you, they were jovial fellows, well suited for making a home in a new country. Each had a good team and would locate on their farms in the spring. The women were all sisters to each other. I headed south again on the mail route. I didn't see another house for 10 miles. About the middle of the afternoon, I saw some small boys playing in the yard of a house. I asked them how far I was from the next settlement. They said it was just over the hill, pointing down the road. I could see a rise in the prairie far ahead, so I kept going until I was at its summit. I saw no house, only another rise in the distance. It began to get dark. I came to another slough the road passed through. In places it was over my knees, still no light anywhere. I heard ducks and geese. I went in that direction through another slough, across a rough prairie, a plowed field, and at length got to the house. It took a while to rise the people, but they took me in. When I told them about the boys and their directions, the man told me it was 21 miles from that place. I stayed all night while my clothes dried, and the next morning started on the mail route to Decatur. The man had not given me much encouragement for the next day. I would have to cross a river that was out of its bottom. There was an old man on the far bank with a canoe, but he didn't think I could make the old man hear me. As luck would have it, I met the old man on this side of the river. We both went back in his canoe, and I stayed all night with him. He was a jolly Frenchman, and wanted me to stay with him till the going got better. There was but him and his wife. Their 2 children were away at school in Decatur. I was on my way the next morning, passed through Sullivan, what there was of it, and headed for Shelbyville. I crossed the Okaw just before Shelbyville and made Ewington on the second day after Shelbyville. I stayed all night with Sam Fleming in Ewington, and the next day arrived at Dismal Creek. It was January 21st, 1853, when I found the man I was looking for. We just stood and looked at each other for a while. He was glad to see me. All he had were some native boys to clear the brush. As the crow flies, the distance William Wilson walked is about 145 miles, longer when one takes in the account of backtracking and zigzag course. It was an incredible journey. Thanks for watching.